everyone has something in their lives that makes them happy and that they value. So I think it's figuring out what that is and encouraging other people to also figure that out for themselves and figuring out how you can make the world a better place using those things that you've been given.
Hey everyone, welcome to a new episode of the Oh My Curry Goodness podcast. I'm your host, Hamza Islam, and this is a podcast where I talk to Gen Zers who are making a difference in their communities, regardless of what field it is, about their journey and how they became the person they are today. I do hope that at the end of each episode, you as the listener are inspired by their stories as you continue to write your own story. Now, I am very excited about my guest this week because my guest is Lily Mott, who is the host of the Be the Change podcast, where she interviews young people making a difference all around the world. And I've been doing podcasts for the past 5 months, and to get ready for my podcast, I would be listening to podcasts like hers. And I love how the conversations she has with people are unique, they're insightful, and they're entertaining. So I'm really excited for this opportunity. So Lily Mott, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having me. That was a great introduction. It's always weird. I'll put it out there. It's always weird to be on this side of the interview. So happy to be here.
Yeah, it's it's interesting because I mean I've never been the guest on the podcast. I've always been the host. So how does it feel? Because normally you should be the one saying, I'm Lily Mott, I'm the host, and now you're just like, oh wait, I actually have to be quiet for 30 seconds.
It's weird. So it's always fun to just kind of I think of it as like having a conversation. I feel like your this podcast is similar. I feel like you wouldn't feel too kind of fish out of water doing it because I feel like both of our podcasts are pretty conversational as far as like playing off of the guest and stuff. So it's not too bad as long as you just think of it as like a conversation, but it definitely is weird to kind of my gears are always spinning as to like the next question instead of the answer to the question that you just asked. So kind of weird, but yeah.
Yeah, I feel that. It's like, because I think at the end of the day, as hosts, one of the most difficult things we have to think about is how do we make sure that the whole experience is good? So it's like we're in a mix of thinking about the next thing, but then also thinking about what they're saying at the time because they might say something really good. So before we talk about podcasting, though, I do want to talk about something that you are very passionate about, which is public service and especially the relationship between media and government. And while you do have a unique vision of storytelling the same way I do, talk me through where the idea of public service comes from and especially the relationship between media and government. Because I think, especially nowadays, we have started to see a shift in being able to focus more on these two things.
Yeah. So for me, I think so a little bit of backstory, but my dad was actually my AP government teacher in high school, and my grandfather is a government professor at Gettysburg College. And so, kind of growing up, I was very, very interested in history and government, and from kind of a young age, I kind of got a bug for like political news. And then when I was 16, Donald Trump was elected, and that was very revolutionizing for just kind of my own story and my worldview. It's what I wrote my college essay about. It was kind of, for me, it was a very formative moment in my life. And I thought, okay, there's kind of multiple ways that I can go at this. And when I went to college, I was kicking around what form of public service I wanted to do because both of my parents are public school teachers. And so education was always kind of there as a public service that I really admired. Journalism was there as also a public service in the sense that I think journalists play a very similar role to teachers in the way that they're educating people and sharing important information that then influences people to make important decisions and really influences people's lives in a really impactful way. So I think journalism was there as another path. And then being a politician was also there. And when I was young, I had my sights set on being the president, and I think a lot of people, do, but I was very much kind of, those were the three avenues that I was looking at. And the people that I really admired were kind of in those different fields. And so when I got to college, though, I really just fell in love with journalism and I started to take some journalism classes, and I go to a really small liberal arts school. So it's kind of rare for these schools to have really great journalism programs, but Washington Lee University, where I do go now, we do have a really good program. So I started to just kind of dive into journalism, and I kind of caught the bug for it. And then I was a freshman when COVID happened. And so we got sent into quarantine, and I ended up I was actually interning for my congressman in DC. And then, of course, the podcast started, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But I think for me, after the podcast and kind of doing more journalism in college, I kind of just caught the bug for storytelling and just talking to people. And that's my passion. I love just having conversations and amplifying stories. And I think I'm kind of getting away from your question here, but yeah, I think the way that public service kind of ties in sharing stories and then being able to educate people about those stories and share maybe voices that otherwise wouldn't have been heard. I think journalism is definitely a form of public service. And I think when I explain it like that, people, I think at first you don't really get the tie between like politics and media and things, but in my brain, I just think all three, kind of education, politics, journalism, they all tie together very well. And so that's kind of my story as far as, amplifying stories and finding people whose voices may not be otherwise heard. And that's kind of my form of public service that I've chosen to kind of weave them all together. But yeah.
Yeah, I think when if we were to go back a few years ago and talked about public service, history, government, journalism, people would be like, "What? No one cares." And then now I think, especially with the political landscape of this country, now people are revisiting the idea of talking about the importance of what has happened in the past that has shaped us into the present, and then tying into the fact of storytelling and how important it is to be involved in government issues. I think, especially like you said, after that 2016 election, we really started to see people on both sides, whether they're Democrat, Republican, and among young people, just being involved in the political landscape. And I think the more we continue to do that, I think the more exciting it is, and the more we really get to understand how to solve some of the issues, and also make sure that there is a compromise. Because I think you know this better than anyone else, as someone who's involved in the government aspect, we are very divided in this country. So it's about how do we bring people together, regardless of what they believe in.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like having conversations and being able to kind of reach across the aisle in that way and put aside some biases, that's been for me such an important part of my journalism career so far. I wouldn't say, I still consider myself to be a student journalist, at least until graduation. But I think like in all of my training, it's been really interesting to be able to talk with people who I otherwise probably wouldn't talk with if it weren't for this field and if it weren't for this profession. And I think I learned something new with every conversation that I have. So yeah, I think it's a really cool way of being able to kind of reach across the aisle often and kind of put biases aside and just learn about other people's perspectives, because there's always something you can learn from someone.
Now, before we transition to the podcast, I do want to revisit the fact that you are a senior at Washington and Lee University. And so I don't know if you've graduated yet as of this recording, or if you're going to, but what have these past few weeks been like for you? Is it something where you're just kind of like, is it one of those situations where for a long time you kind of just thought of, oh, I'm just going to Washington Lee University, and now you're like, oh my gosh, I'm about to graduate? Or what's been that mindset like?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to, I forget when you told me that the podcast is going to air. It'll be the 25th, May 25th is my actual graduation date. So I haven't graduated as of this conversation. We're in like our last week. So we have a spring term class. And so we do 4 weeks of just one class. And often it's professors' passion projects, or it's just kind of, we do like, 3 hours of class a day, and the rest is just up to us. So it's wonderful. It's great, like setup. It's really fun to just kind of dive into a class. And I'm doing investigative reporting right now. So graduation seems kind of far off because I'm still trying to meet the deadlines and things. But I think for me, my college experience has been really interesting. I like to say that it was kind of chunked into 4 different years more than it was an entire 4-year experience for me. I, of course, got sent home when I was a freshman for COVID. And then I came back, and Washington and Lee had all of us back on campus, and they really tried to create an in-person experience as much as they could for my sophomore year. Of course, it was pretty difficult as far as we still had kind of hybrid classes, and Lexington, Virginia is very small, where Washington Lee is, and we share it with Virginia Military Institute, which creates a very interesting town environment. And so COVID year was very, very strange. That sophomore year was a really strange transition. And at the beginning of my sophomore year, I found out about an experience to study abroad for the next year. So it would be my junior year. So I applied and I got accepted. And so my junior year I spent in Oxford. And I got to spend the whole year, which was awesome. I got to do 3 terms and they do 8-week terms. So 3 of those. And it was so much fun and I learned so much. So that was a great experience, but that was kind of a separate year in itself. And then coming back here to kind of finish things off has been a really cool experience to just see all my friends, see the professors. I've had a lot of work to kind of catch up on because of the year abroad, a lot of journalism classes that I had to finish up. But it's been really fun to take this whole year to just kind of reset and be back in the US and kind of get back to college life. And it's been a really cool experience to just be back in Lexington and kind of have that college experience that I feel like I missed out on a little bit because of COVID. So it's been cool to be back here. But yeah, very kind of chunked up. So I feel like I definitely don't feel like I'm ready to graduate. I also do feel like I'm really ready to graduate. And I think what I'm doing next is really exciting because I'm not freaked out about that. So that's good. But yeah, definitely mixed feelings for sure.
Yeah, when I started college during that pandemic year. So like that fall of 2020 was my first semester in college. And so I think even today, I don't know how to properly do college or like how to balance college because for a long time, because I was so used to high school classes, and then I was then used to online classes. So it's like doing things at your own pace. And then now it's like there's a sudden transition from doing things at your own time to now thinking about how do you manage everything. So I think that's what made college like difficult for me. And it's weird because even though I'm not going to be graduating these upcoming few weeks, because I still have one more year left, I think for me, one of the things I usually fall into is kind of not take, or what's the word I'm looking for? I would say just more like, I'm trying to think. It's just one of those things where like I didn't really understand what those moments meant for me during the freshman and sophomore year. So now as someone who finished their third year, I think like now is where I'm in the situation where I'm kind of able to reflect back and meet all the people. And then as I go into senior year, knowing that that's going to be my last year of college, it's just like, all these moments where I kind of just thought of, oh, it was just a class, it was just school or whatever. Now I'm like, wait a minute, there are so many people that have helped me become the person who I am today. And even if they played a small part, it's that because of that person, I'm able to become a better person I am today than if I didn't meet these kind of people. So I think it is interesting. And I don't know if that kind of directly ties into what you said, but the fact that there are certain things or certain people in your life, especially even if you're going abroad, that have shaped you into the person you are today. And I think it's a testament to all the people that really want to see the best version of you going forward.
Yeah. And I think it is cool, especially next year when you're a senior too, to just be able to kind of reflect on that. Because I feel like while you're in it, you don't really realize, how many people you're kind of seeing on a daily basis and how many people have been supporting you, and you just don't really think about it that often. And I feel like it's kind of sad because a lot of people reflect on that after they're finished. And I think it's been really interesting for me to have had that year away because I almost had that reflecting process prematurely. And then I was able to come back and realize how much they meant to me and how much value a lot of those people had in my life. So I'm glad that you say that, because I feel like then you'll be able to kind of have that experience and have that reckoning a little bit early because you're already thinking about it. But I would definitely say, yeah, just keep all that close, because then you're going to be bummed when you leave and you realize, oh, they were so important and they've supported me so much.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Now, the name of the podcast is called "Oh My Curry Goodness" because when we hear stories that are interesting, we say "Oh my goodness." And then, as someone who's South Asian, I love curry, so I included the word curry. And I have to say, you have definitely one of the most interesting "Oh my goodness" stories on this podcast, because part of what inspired Be the Change was that you during, I think, it was obviously summer of 2020, where you were participating in the Black Lives Matter protests. And then I think, which was really interesting, your phone battery was at 7% and you recorded those protests. And that really inspired the whole Be the Change podcast. And you can obviously feel free to talk more about it because I may have botched up some of the things. But one of the things that I always think about is those what if moments. And so maybe not necessarily the Black Lives Matter or being the experience of participating in those protests, but I don't know what your experiences was before doing podcasting, but if it wasn't for the 7% of battery remaining on your phone, do you still think we could have seen Be the Change podcast and where it is today?
So it's actually really interesting because I've thought a lot about this question because I think a lot of it was that spur of the moment kind of they were the first protests of the summer, the ones that I went to. And it was interesting because I actually had been kicking around this idea of creating a podcast. It was kind of a very popular thing. I think podcasts were a very, of course, they were around before, but they were a huge COVID phenomenon. Everyone was sitting around and, you can always just pull up your phone and start recording if you want, just start talking into it and bam, you've got a podcast. So I think a lot of people were starting them. And when I was home before I left for Washington, D.C., I had started to kind of kick around, maybe a podcast would be something interesting to do because I don't need anyone else necessarily. I can maybe hop on a Zoom and interview someone, or I can figure out a way. I just didn't really have an idea. And I was like, I would like to talk to people, but about what? I don't know, who, not sure. So then when I had this experience, it was really interesting because my phone, the whole phone being on 7%, I had actually talked to my dad and I was walking back to my apartment and I was just going to go and eat dinner. And my dad was asking me about the protests that were going on and if I had seen them, because I was actually right on Capitol Hill for that summer. That's where I was staying. And he was like, are the protests around you? And I was like, yeah, I had seen some of them kind of in the city, but I was like, yeah, it's cool. I'm going to go home and eat dinner. And he was like, what? Like, what are you doing? You talk all the time about wanting to be a journalist and that's what you're training to do. This moment is history. This is an important moment and this will go down in the history books because of the significance of this event and because of COVID and this situation, you being in DC, it's like the perfect storm. Go, you're watching history unfolding. And so my dad has always been a huge role model of mine. And so I was listening to his words and I was like, he's absolutely right. What I didn't tell my parents was that my phone was on 7%. And I just took off running towards the protest, which was across DC. And so then I ended up being able to record some of the audio from that protest and took some photos and things. And that night was the night that Trump cleared out protesters from what would become Black Lives Matter Plaza. And so people were tear gassed and there were rubber bullets flying. And it was a really interesting experience for me to be in that I hadn't ever experienced anything like that before. And the first time I'd seen tear gas, the first time I'd been involved in anything like that. And so I stayed there for a while into that night. And then I ended up going back to my apartment and recording just my thoughts on what I had seen, because I knew a lot of people were seeing it on the news. But I think a big part of that moment in the civil rights movement, especially because so many people were in quarantine and they were just watching this unfolding in the news, I think a lot of people didn't understand what it actually felt like to be there. And there was very much this, I'm watching it and I'm kind of internalizing it, but I don't know anyone that's there, or I'm not there personally. And so I really just wanted to provide perspective for my friends and family as to this is what's going on. And I was involved and I might as well share the story. And so I like to say, the first one was my story at this protest. And then since then it's turned into other people's stories. But I think a lot about how I think it was kind of a perfect storm moment for me to start the podcast. I think probably something like it would have happened in some way or another. I'm not sure what form the podcast would be, but I did have kind of podcasting in my brain. But yeah, I think Be the Change definitely started because of that whole experience. And the actual start of Be the Change is the audio that I recorded at the protest that day. So it's cool because it's kind of stuck with me. That was its roots and its origin, and I've been able to kind of maintain it since then. But yeah, that's an interesting. I have thought a lot about what would happen without that protest in that moment, but probably in some other form, a podcast would have still been created, just probably not the way that it is today.
Yeah, so when I started podcasting in that summer of 2020, and it was just the idea of being able to talk to people, and I didn't know anything about podcasting beforehand, so I just kind of just went, well, I like to be able to know what it's like to be a specific person. So that was my experience with podcasting. But I do love the fact that, part of this was inspired because of your dad being able to say, "Hey, you're a journalist. This is what's happening in the real world. So go out and just see what's happening in the world." And I never participated in those protests, but what I would see often in the news is you hear different reactions to what's going on. So you'll see one side going, "Oh, look at these people privately protesting for Black Lives Matter," and then you'll see the other side going, "Look at these people rioting the streets," or whatever that may be. And as someone who got to be able to participate in those protests in person, obviously the way you saw the protests will be different from someone from an aerial view or on TV. But what was it like to be in those protests? And even though your dad kind of inspired you to get involved, were you ever worried, and I hate to say this from an extreme point of view, but were you ever worried about the idea, or were you ever worried about your safety? Because who knows what could have happened, right? Because I mean, there were things that were peaceful, and then there were bad times, and it's like your life is important at the end of the day. So, what was going through your mind during that time?
Yeah, I think definitely for me, it was being very kind of intent. I was very aware kind of the whole time of, I think I took a much more journalistic mindset rather than an organizing mindset or an activist mindset throughout those protests, where a lot of journalists were there, but were more on the sidelines as far as getting out of the way when the tear gas happened, not being involved in the rubber bullets. And I think that's what's really interesting about being a journalist. And I think that's also why these protests kind of gave me the bug, where you can be there and you can be experiencing it, but that also doesn't mean that you need to be involved in it, or you should be. Of course, this kind of gets into the ethics of journalists of journalism, and a lot of kind of the demons that come with journalism, because you do see a lot of really difficult things often, and the best stories that have been reported, reporters have kind of put themselves on the line and really put their safety on the line as well. And so I think for me, it was that interesting line of being very aware in those situations and saying, yes, I do want to, record this and I want to take these photos, but I also need to stay safe. And at that time I was a 19-year-old girl by myself in DC, so I think also being very aware of my own, identity and my own safety, just as who I was in my in that at that point in time. I think it was interesting because for me, I was really focused on the way that other young people were really existing in that moment, because I thought a lot about how some of the people that were leading that movement in DC, they were college kids and high school kids. And so I think that really comforted me a lot, where I said, if they're out here doing this and they're, being so brave and they're so confident to be able to organize these movements, and they were leading these marches and these protests, then I can definitely be here and I feel safe being here. And, these people are supporting them. And of course, I'm here providing a perspective and, informing people about what's happening. And so I think that gave me a lot of confidence as far as, look at what they're doing and they're really putting themselves on the line. I can definitely be here sharing their stories and talking to them and hopefully amplifying their voices for a wider audience, just to share the work that they're doing. Because yeah, it was such an important moment and I wanted to capture it in the best way I could, while of course still being aware and careful about my safety.
Yeah, I mean, well, firstly, I do want to applaud you for being able to be involved in these protests because, I mean, I think, it did spark the conversation about race in America and realizing that there are certain people being affected, and how do we help them and realize that we also need to change as well. Now, going into Be the Change, tell me a bit about if podcasting ever was a learning curve, or do you feel like you kind of had it, you kind of knew what you're doing? And I'll give you an example. So when I started podcasting, I thought podcasting was the same thing as talking. And you could be the most outgoing person, but ultimately podcast is a form of art in a way, in terms of presenting and everything. So for you, was there ever a learning curve, or do you feel like you kind of knew what you were doing, or everything was kind of going your way? I feel like that's an easy answer, but you get what I'm saying? Like, did you kind of have to like learn as you go, and I'm sure you're still learning today, or do you feel like everything was kind of settled in?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a learning curve. I would say I kind of go back and forth with, I've been asked kind of advice for podcasters often, and I kind of go back and forth with this because I think I'm grateful in the way that I had a learning curve, and I'm kind of grateful that I just dove into it in the way that I did. I started off just literally recording myself on my phone and just publishing that and just figuring out kind of how to get it on different platforms. And it was all just YouTube, Google how-tos, Amazon reviews as far as getting a microphone and equipment and things. But I think that was very fitting for my story, as far as I had the story that I wanted to tell of my own. And then I had this idea to keep interviewing local activists. And it just sort of, for me, that was really easy. I just kind of had a lot of time while I was interning to just sit down and be like, okay, how do I do this? Can I figure this out? However, I would say, I think for a lot of people that do have kind of an idea in mind, and maybe it's not as thrown together and it's not as organic or last minute, it does make a lot of sense to sit down and actually kind of figure out what equipment you need, maybe what audio editing software you need, how you're going to even package it. Like you were saying, it is an art form, as far as like there's, theme music to be, there's different, jingles if you want, there's background music. So for me, it was very much a learning curve as far as the first episode. I won't even go back and listen to that one because it is kind of, it's emotional in the sense of like, it's my story and stuff, but also just it's just thrown together. It's very, it's organic, and that's the way that it should be. But I think now at this point, if I were to compare my most recent episode and that one, definitely a learning curve there. And I think also it's okay to have that. And I would never go back and take down some of those first episodes, because I think that is important to the story, and that's important to the podcast that I've created, to show just kind of where it's been and where it is now. And I don't think that that means that those first episodes are any less important, or the first interviews are any less interesting. Even I think that I started to get better at it and figure out kind of what the podcast needed. And I also think just consuming a lot of podcasts, I've also realized that there's always another thing that you can do, and there's always something else that you can add. And I'm sure that you feel the same way, but I kind of have some constraints on my time and as a student, and of course doing a lot of other things. I'm not a professional by any means, but there's certainly always things that I would like to continue to add and things like that. But I think for me, I've definitely been able to learn, and it's a crazy learning curve. And I think if I would have reached out to more people, and I always say, if anyone's interested in, trying to put together a podcast and stuff, I can definitely send some recommendations, because I didn't really do that. I just kind of learned on the go. And if there are people that you can reach out to, or if there's an idea that you have that you want to run by people, send it to me. But I think, yeah, I go back and forth with that. Like, I think it's great to have a plan, and it's great to have something that you really want to do. But yeah, for me, it was just kind of slapdash, and I've had a huge learning curve since then. So
Yeah, I feel the same way, because when I first started, I mean, obviously I had some really good moments, but then I always thought, how can I make the next episode better? And it's not to say like, let me make the first episode bad, but it's like, there's always something you can improve. So I often feel like every episode in a way is like a guinea pig. So it's like, okay, this worked, but this didn't. Okay, so what's next? And it's like, it's not to say that I want to make this episode bad, but it's like, there's always this mindset of getting better 1% every day. So it's about, how do I make this one better? Because ultimately, there's always something to learn. It's not like, even if you are satisfied that you're done, it's just, you got to keep going. And so I think that's what has helped me realize how to make the best experience possible. Because I think as a fellow podcaster, it's so easy to get bogged down on the views and how many people are sharing and whatever. But then I guess that's not how you really should define success. It's just what's going on at the moment, and are you able to inspire the person listening, and also able to inspire the guest in a way. I don't know if that's something you can allude to, but
Yeah. I think that's true. And I think for me, it's been really eye-opening to realize that I'm not doing it for the monetization, or the views, or this is, by no means, when I do my podcast, it's certainly not a professional thing that I think I'm trying to do for a career. For me, it's very much like a hobby. And it's a passion of mine, and I think whenever I look at it like that, as long as I'm enjoying it, and as long as I feel like it's kind of a competition with myself, like you were saying, as far as how can I make this better? For me, a lot of it is, how can I do justice for my guests? So if I, feel like I presented their story and who they are well, that's a win for me. And I think just kind of remembering the mission of the podcast, that it is to amplify stories and hopefully get some people tuned into the work that these young people are doing. But at the end of the day, it's certainly not about kind of the following or the audience. And I keep that in mind a lot, where it's like, of course you can get bogged down in that, but it's like, are you still going through with the mission of the podcast? And are you still, doing justice to those people that you set out to talk to and to share their stories? So yeah, that's an interesting idea. But I think, for me, I just always keep that in mind. It's like, it's more of a competition with myself than anything else, I think.
Yeah. When you first started out, how often did you deal with self-doubt? Because when I first started, I literally started the podcast by saying, my name is Hamza Islam. I'm a third year studying computer science and I'm a student at Ohio State, but I love talking to people. And that's literally what I did. And so obviously it's kind of hard to be able to take a chance on someone like that because there's not much to do. So as someone like yourself, because I remember when you first started, you talked about how you're a student at Washington Lee University and you're just recording what was going on. Did you, at those early moments or even today, do you still deal with self-doubt, or how do you describe that relationship?
I think for me, there's a lot of being nervous to hit the publish button. And I think I have started to overcome that with, I've published, I think kind of as you do more of them, you start to realize it's okay, I'm good, and I think I've gotten a lot more confident with just, I know how to use my software very well, and I know kind of it's kind of a routine, but also, of course, every week when you hit that publish button, it goes out, and so I think that's kind of the scary thing to think about for me, where I'm like, I also do just take a lot of, I'm so careful about making sure that every episode is the way that I want it to be, because that does reflect on my guests as well. And of course, I wouldn't want to put anything out there that isn't doing them justice. So I think it's not necessarily self-doubt for me as much as it is like, I want the guests to feel comfortable with what I put out there and feel like I did a good job. And so I think I always feel a little bit beholden to them, where that's kind of my motivation, where I'm like, okay, yes, I'm nervous about this, but it's also because of the guest and because I want to put their story out there well. And I think that actually comes from my journalism background, because at my school, we have this thing called a fact error F. And so if we have a single fact error, so if we spell a name wrong, if we mess up an age, if there's a detail that's messed up, a data point, anything like that, we get a 0 on the assignment. And so I have been trained to very, very carefully check kind of details and things, which has made me more confident, because I think that I just am very meticulous at this point, which probably not a good thing in other aspects of my life, but as far as podcasting, it's a good thing. But yeah, so I think just kind of the more I've done it, the more confident I've gotten. And also just remembering it's not only my own name that's on the line, it's other people's too, I think also helps me. It's kind of a motivating factor.
Yeah, I feel the same way. It's like, as long as the guest I'm talking to is satisfied with everything, then it's like, okay, forget the potential negatives. It's like they like it, so then that's all that matters in a way. Because ultimately, like you said, yes, it's you, but it's also them as well. And so the fact that they like it, I think it makes the situation less worse. But as a podcaster, when I listen to your podcast, I do love the chemistry and the questions you're asking them, because you're getting a guest to think. But in your mind, and only you know this best, what is going through your mind when you're interviewing people? Are you worried about the same things that I would worry about when I'm interviewing, which is, are they liking the interview? Because that's what I do with every guest. I'm like I'll be having fun with them and whatever, but I'm also in the same time going, I hope they're liking the conversation and where it's going. Is that something you worry about, or not so much?
I think for me, my biggest worry whenever I've had conversations, and this is actually interesting because I haven't thought that much about this. It's a good thinking about my thinking, I guess. But I am always worried about saying something that, I talk with guests who cover a lot of controversial issues, and especially a lot of them have had very personal experiences with the topics that they're talking with me about. So I talk with a lot of mental health activists and gun violence activists, and I am very aware that I'm young and I'm getting started with my journalism career. So as far as kind of covering some of those topics and figuring out the best way to relate to people, myself having not had some of those experiences, that's definitely my biggest concern when I talk with people. It's that I would never want to say something that, or ask a question that they feel is inappropriate, or phrase it poorly so that then it does come off as inappropriate. That's always what I'm really worried about, because I, of course, would never want anyone to feel like you were saying. I want them to enjoy the interview. And the whole point is to share their story and really share the work that they're doing. So I would never want to put them in a situation where they feel like they have to disclose something to me or go into a really deep story that they didn't want to share or offend anyone. I think that's a big thing for me, especially if I don't know the topic very well that they're talking about, which often I don't, because a lot of these people are experts and they're, activists and they know a lot about these issues. So I think I always kind of approach that with just asking very open questions, at least to begin, and always qualifying with if you feel comfortable. You can definitely say no. We don't have to, not every question needs to be asked. You don't need to tell that story if you don't want to. So I think that's kind of my biggest thing when I go into interviews, is just how do I kind of draw those boundaries, and how do I make sure that I'm being the best host and the most respectful host that I can be.
Yeah, no, I feel the same way too. Whenever I interview people, I'm always real. What is literally the worst possible thing that you could say? Because your intention is obviously not to harm them or hurt them and whatever. But sometimes there is that moment where you're like, maybe I should go this direction. But then if you take this direction, what if they take it differently? And then you're kind of the bad guy, or the bad person in the sense. So I think that's what I constantly think about. Obviously, there are the other things like, am I stuttering? Am I doing whatever, you know, small things. But I think the main thing is, when I'm having a conversation, if what I'm talking about or where I want the conversation to go, will it lead me into a really bad situation? Because obviously your intention is one thing, but then because you're putting your guest in a really uncomfortable situation, then it's like, oh crap, what do I do for me? What do I do? So I think that's really what makes podcasting and interviewing difficult. But I'm glad that, as someone who has done Be the Change for so many years, I'm glad that's not something you don't really. I mean, that's not something that's ever been an issue. I don't know. I'm usually listening, so obviously you probably know it better than I do.
Yeah, I don't think, and I think that has been something that I've learned a lot too. And I think that it's definitely going to make me a better journalist. And when I do kind of come into situations that are very, I think a lot about talking with someone who's maybe on the scene of an active shooter at a high school, for example, and talking to family members. I think that's an issue that I think about a lot. Of course, being an American and being in this country, and that's an issue that we're obviously reckoning with. That is the type of scenario that I think this podcast is also really setting me up for, as far as just thinking about kind of the best way to talk with people in the most respectful way, and the best way to kind of approach situations where they may feel like the questions I'm asking are too personal, or they're very emotional, or it's a very tense situation. And of course, recording a podcast episode and doing a Zoom is different than being in a live scenario, of course. But I think it's definitely taught me a lot about empathy, and just kind of asking big, comfortable questions, and then kind of diving in a little bit more. But yeah, I think it's definitely an interesting thing to think about and to talk about, because I haven't really thought about it that much before, but I think it's become more natural. So that's a good thing.
Yeah. And I think you kind of answered my next question, which is, how has podcast helped you from a more personal level? Because for those who know you will recognize, oh, you're Lily Mott, you're the host of the Be the Change podcast. They'll see me, they'll be like, oh, you're the host of the Oh My Curry Goodness podcast. But how has podcasting helped you from a personal level? And I'll give you an example for me. So I think with this podcast, it has done two things. One, which is being okay with meeting new people, because obviously when you meet new people, there's a sense of like hesitancy, because it's like, I'm not used to talking to them, meeting them. But then also there came a point in time where I used to be afraid to talk to people. And so now this podcast has helped me just being able to have conversations. So I could go to anyone and be able to say, hey, how are you? Or it doesn't really matter if it's like a podcast sense, but it's like, I'm able to have conversations regardless of who it is. So for you, do you feel like there is something that you used to be like scared of that you've overcome because of your podcast? Or how would you describe the how your podcast has helped you from a more personal level?
I think for me, the personal side of doing the podcast has been just how much I've been able to learn. I think that's been, whenever I reflect on kind of what I'm taking away from each episode, especially after editing it and listening to it back. And of course, the process of putting together the podcast, I think that I've been able to just learn so much about so many different issues. My guests have covered a variety of things, also depending on where they're from. Of course, there's entirely different issues that young people are dealing with on every continent, but the issues that activists are facing in Nigeria are very different from the US, which are very different from the UK. And so I think I've just been able to really have this worldview of really important issues that are impacting people, and especially often on a very personal level because people are sharing their personal stories with me. And so I think that's also been kind of a sub goal of the podcast, where I've gotten to just really learn myself. I've gotten to learn about these issues, and I've gotten to educate, of course, my audience, I hope, about these issues as well. But just kind of my own, I guess, selfish takeaway from that has been I've gotten to learn about issues that and kind of do a strange little deep dive into some of them as far as doing my own research. And just if I'm really interested in what the activist on my podcast is saying, of course, I'll kind of go and follow up a little bit. But I would say that I know a lot about issues that I never would have known about before, which I think is also a really cool plus of journalism as well, because you're kind of doing different stories every day and you're talking to different people who are passionate about things that you may not have even known about. And so yeah, I think that's kind of my personal takeaway. I've just gotten to really broaden my scope of especially political issues and my political knowledge.
Yeah. Before I let you go, I do want to talk about the future. You've obviously done Be the Change for, I think, since summer of 2020. So obviously almost 3 years. And then, like you mentioned in the beginning, you're going to be graduating soon. What does the future look like for you and for Be the Change? Because I think, I'm not saying this because you're on this podcast. I do genuinely mean when I say that you have a really good podcast and a great way to connect with people and their stories. But do you hope that at some point you continue to do this in the future, or what does it look like?
Yeah, I think ultimately, of course, I've been thinking about this a lot, but I would love to do something like this professionally. I always think about Christiana Amanpour. She's like my gold standard of kind of what she does for a living, where she just gets to talk to people who are extremely influential and they're all around the world. And she's so talented and she's able to relate to people who so many people I couldn't imagine being in the room with these people, and she's able to have a very meaningful, respectful, interesting, educational conversation with them. And so I think I would love to do something like this forever and as a career, because I think I've just really enjoyed having conversations, and like you were saying, of course, that's a passion of yours too. So I think we'll see where Be the Change goes. I think it's interesting to kind of figure out how it's going to evolve, especially after graduating. And I don't ever want to be the person who is old out of touch and asking like younger people about the work that in their lives. And I don't ever want to be the person that kind of doesn't get the lingo anymore and is just out of touch. So I don't know, I mean, I'm definitely very aware of that. I don't want to be kind of out of date, and I especially want to be able to still relate to a lot of the guests that I have. So that's definitely been something that I've been thinking about. But yeah, I think as far as kind of the format of Be the Change and what that work has meant to me, I really want to continue to do something like this. But yeah, as far as the form that takes and whether it's professional or, what the field and what the form looks like, we'll see. But yeah, I think journalism is definitely for me. So in some way or another, it's definitely going to be that field at least.
No, I feel the same way, because even though I started this is like technically 5 months in, I want to continue to have, I guess, like a talk show of some sort where I just want to interview Gen Zers about just what it's like to be them. Because I think for us, our generation especially, and maybe, I don't know how you think of it, but I don't think we get a chance to really talk about ourselves, because so many people care more about the who they are versus the what they are. And so I think for me, it's like, I do hope that with this podcast, and obviously you have your goals as well, which is the fact that we not only want to inspire people to do something special, but also being okay to be vulnerable and to talk about just their story. And I know based on your podcast, you've had a few guests where they're able to share their personal side of things. And it's like, we need to do more of that, because oftentimes we just don't, or nor are we given the space to do so. And it's like, and obviously you do this a lot, which is the importance of just letting people just truly be themselves, because authenticity is a really superpower. So there may be things that you are good at that I'm not good at, and there are good things I'm good at that you're not good at. So it's not like you and I are better or worse, but we're just humans at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I think that's so true. I think the joy of like doing podcasting and being able to talk to people is I always say figuring out that one thing that makes them just light up, and they could talk about it for days. And I think that's always kind of my goal with talking to people, and especially talking with guests, is just figuring out what that one thing is, because everybody has it. Everyone has something that they're just thrilled and they're so excited to talk about. And whether that's activism or change making, which often it is for my guests, it's just so exciting to find that thing and be able to just listen to them and watch them talk about it. It's such an awesome experience that I just definitely want to do as long as I can. But yeah, it's kind of a bug that you catch.
Yeah. My last question, and this is a question that you probably know, you've probably been asked a lot, or I'm sure you've heard of. And throughout this whole conversation, I've been trying to think of it as I've been trying to think of it, trying to think of a way to ask this while you were talking. So hopefully I don't botch this up. But lots of young people, particularly college students, want to create change, but they don't have a place to start. What advice would you give for them? Now, for those of you wondering why me and Lily are laughing, that is Lily Mott's last question after every episode of Be the Change. So I know you've been asking your guests that, so I want you to be able to answer that question.
Yes. Okay. I think I've thought about this a lot actually, because I have never been asked this. So I always think about what I would say if somebody asked me that. So my life motto, the thing that I am really driven by and I just think about often, I actually have a necklace. I'm not wearing it today, unfortunately, but it says, to whom much is given, and on the other side it says much is expected. And that's Latin, it's noblesse oblige. And so I think that is the advice that I would give everyone in a nutshell. But as that kind of transitions into projects and things, I think that everyone has something that they can be grateful for in this world. And I think that everyone has been given some privilege, and whether that's financial, whether that's familial support, whether that's education, whether there's even just one person in your life who you feel like you connect with and who is looking out for you, that is some sort of privilege that you have in your life, and that's something that you can use to give back to others. And so I think for me, I think a lot about this ripple effect of change making and positivity. And I think that it really starts with thinking about what you have and thinking about what makes you special and what you have in your life that you really value, and just how you can use that to do something for others and to kind of empower others to also look into themselves and figure out what that is for them. So I think it is kind of a ripple effect. But I think that's been kind of my motivation in life, as far as if I can tell a story or I can share someone's voice who, inspire someone else to also go and make change, and or not even make change, but just improve their lives, improve the lives of someone else, even if that is, as cliche as it sounds, giving someone a hug, smiling at someone on the street, that does make a difference. And so I think everyone has something in their lives that makes them happy and that they value. So I think it's figuring out what that is and encouraging other people to also figure that out for themselves, and figuring out how you can make the world a better place using those things that you've been given. So yeah, to whom much is given, much is expected. And I think we all have something that we've been given, and so something is expected of us.
And this is why you're one of my favorite podcasters to listen to. But yeah, I think we were talking about this in the beginning, which is one of the things that we as hosts struggle with, which is think about what they're saying at the moment, and then also think about how can we build off of that. So this whole time I was just like, how can I word this? Because I was listening to like the past few episodes, and I was like, okay, I got it. And then I'm like, wait, no, I don't got it. So hopefully that was accurate. But I do think at the end of the day, it is an important question to ask, because there's so many people that want to inspire change and whatever that may be, but they don't really know where to start. And so I think just being able to take a few things away from what you said hopefully inspires listeners or whoever that may be to realize that they can create change, and it doesn't matter who they are.
Yeah, I think so. And it is that whole, I think you're doing it too, with talking to young people who are doing really cool things and who have great stories. Because I think as many people as you hear who, of course, we're all figuring it out. I don't want to say that anyone's, successful and they've made it, especially at our age. There's so much there's so many things to explore and so many things to do. But I think if you can hear from people who are doing really cool things, that's awesome. And I think that I love this podcast because I think that you're really sharing some cool stories, and that's definitely going to impact other people, and it impacts the listeners. And at the very least, you get to have these really cool conversations and we get to share them with you. So it's awesome.
No, I really appreciate it. But Lily, I know I've taken so much of your time. I know you are busy these next few weeks, but I just want to say thank you so much for joining the podcast. It was really great talking to you, and I wish you nothing but the best for the future, whether it's for yourself or for Be the Change.
Awesome. And you too. I can't wait to follow along, listen to more episodes. And I really appreciate it. I know this is a busy time for everybody, but good luck with everything. I can't wait to follow along.
Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. If you like what you saw, be sure to subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow us on Instagram at the OMCG Podcast for more information on guests, preview clips, and more. Please continue to support this podcast. I really do appreciate all the support I've received since the start of this podcast, and I can't wait to see you guys in the next episode.